Who was Jeffrey Epstein? Jeffrey Epstein was not born into extraordinary power. He grew up in Brooklyn, taught briefly at a prestigious prep school without a college degree, and somehow transitioned into finance, where he cultivated an image of exclusivity and wealth. By the 1990s and early 2000s, he had become known as a financier who moved comfortably among billionaires, academics, politicians, royalty, and celebrities. He owned multiple properties, most famously a Manhattan townhouse, a Palm Beach mansion, a ranch in New Mexico, and a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands. He traveled by private jet and hosted elite gatherings. His brand was mystery. Few could clearly explain the source of his fortune, but many enjoyed access to the social circles he curated. Behind that facade, federal investigators would later uncover a pattern of sexual abuse involving underage girls that stretched over years. The story that now trends as the Epstein Files is not just about one man. It is about systems, legal, financial, and social, that failed repeatedly before finally confronting him. The first case, Florida and the controversial deal. In the mid-2000s, local police in Palm Beach began investigating allegations that Epstein had paid underage girls for sexual massages. What began as a local case soon expanded into a federal investigation. In 2008, Epstein reached a controversial non-prosecution agreement with federal prosecutors in Florida. Instead of facing significant federal charges, he pled guilty to state charges of soliciting prostitution and procuring a minor for prostitution. He served approximately 13 months in a county jail under unusually lenient conditions, including work release privileges. The U.S. Attorney's Office involved at the time was led by future U.S. Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta. Years later, the deal would resurface as a national controversy, raising questions about prosecutorial discretion, political pressure, and preferential treatment. Critics argued that the plea agreement shielded not only Epstein, but potentially unnamed co-conspirators. Victims later claimed they were not properly informed of the deal, leading to further litigation. The phrase Epstein Files often traces back to documents related to this 2008 agreement. Sealed records, correspondence, and internal memoranda that fueled suspicion of deeper protection. Reopening the case. 2019 arrest. More than a decade after his first conviction, Epstein was arrested again in July 2019, this time by federal prosecutors in New York. The charges came from the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York and alleged sex trafficking of minors. Prosecutors described a pattern: recruitment of underage girls, payment for sexual acts, and a network that operated across multiple properties. This arrest felt different. Public scrutiny was intense. Media coverage was relentless. Social media amplified every development. The idea that a wealthy, well-connected man might finally face serious consequences captured global attention. Then, only weeks after his arrest, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. His death was ruled a suicide. But the circumstances, security camera malfunctions, sleeping guards, prior reports of self-harm, triggered widespread suspicion. The phrase Epstein Files became shorthand not just for court records, but for unanswered questions. The role of Ghislaine Maxwell. One name consistently linked to Epstein is Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell, a British socialite and daughter of media magnate Robert Maxwell, had been a visible presence in Epstein's social life for decades. Prosecutors later described her as instrumental in recruiting and grooming underage girls for Epstein. In 2020, Maxwell was arrested. In 2021, she was convicted on federal sex trafficking charges and later sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her trial reignited interest in the broader network surrounding Epstein. Court documents, testimonies, and exhibits added layers of detail about how the abuse was organized and sustained. Yet, even with Maxwell's conviction, many observers felt the story was incomplete. The Epstein Files explained. When people refer to the Epstein Files, they usually mean a combination of court filings,
civil and criminal, flight logs from Epstein's private jet, deposition transcripts, victim testimonies, FBI investigative materials, documents unsealed by court order. Over the years, judges have unsealed batches of documents in related lawsuits. Each release sparks headlines. However, it's critical to understand, being mentioned in a document does not equal wrongdoing. Flight logs show who traveled on Epstein's plane, but not why. Social contact does not automatically imply criminal involvement. Courts distinguish between association and evidence of crime. Public discourse often blurs that distinction. High-profile names and public reaction. Because Epstein cultivated elite connections, many prominent figures' names appeared in various documents or logs. Some publicly acknowledged limited social contact before distancing themselves. Others denied deeper association. A few faced lawsuits or investigations. For example, Britain's Prince Andrew faced civil allegations related to Epstein's network. He denied wrongdoing, but later reached a financial settlement in a U.S. civil case without admitting liability. The appearance of political figures, business leaders, academics, and celebrities in Epstein-related documents fueled intense speculation across partisan lines. This bipartisan entanglement is part of why the story repeatedly trends. It disrupts simple political narratives. Institutional questions. How did this continue for so long? The Epstein case raises broader structural concerns. Prosecutorial discretion. How did a wealthy defendant secure such a favorable plea agreement in 2008? Financial opacity. How did Epstein maintain his wealth with limited public transparency? Elite networks. Did social status create informal shields? Victim credibility. Why were survivors' accounts initially minimized? The FBI's role also comes under scrutiny. The Federal Bureau of Investigation has faced criticism over investigative gaps, missed signals, and jail oversight failures. Yet, it is equally important to distinguish systemic failure from coordinated conspiracy. Institutional incompetence and privilege can produce devastating outcomes without requiring secret orchestration. The broader cultural context. The Epstein scandal unfolded during the Me Too era, when public tolerance for powerful men exploiting vulnerable women had sharply declined. Survivors' testimonies gained broader support than they might have in earlier decades. Media outlets revisited past reporting decisions. Questions were asked not just about criminals, but about gatekeepers. The case became symbolic of wealth insulating misconduct, social prestige masking abuse, legal systems bending under influence. Whether or not all questions are answered, the story represents a shift in public willingness to scrutinize power. Why it keeps trending? The Epstein files trend periodically for several reasons. New batches of documents are unsealed. Political cycles revive discussion. High-profile individuals are mentioned in court records. Online communities speculate about redactions or missing names. The unresolved circumstances of Epstein's death resurface. There's also a psychological factor. People struggle with incomplete narratives. Epstein died before trial. No courtroom airing of all evidence occurred. No comprehensive testimony under cross-examination. That absence creates narrative vacuum. And where there is vacuum, speculation grows. What we know and what we don't. What is firmly established? Epstein was convicted in 2008 on state charges. He was federally charged again in 2019. He died in custody. Ghislaine Maxwell was convicted of sex trafficking. Numerous victims have testified to abuse. Civil settlements have been reached with Epstein's estate. Yet, compensation does not erase harm. If the files matter, they matter because they document patterns of exploitation, not because they hint at scandalous associations. Power, secrecy, and accountability. The Epstein saga exposes how power operates, through access, through image, through legal leverage, through social insulation. It also demonstrates how fragile that insulation can be once public scrutiny intensifies. But accountability remains partial. Epstein never stood trial for his federal charges. That absence leaves history without a definitive judicial record. And so the documents, unsealed, debated, dissected, become substitutes for a trial that never happened. The files as a mirror. The Epstein files are not just legal records. They are a mirror reflecting distrust in institutions, anger at elite privilege, concern about justice disparities, fear that power hides more than it reveals. The reason the story resurfaces is not only because of what was done, but because of what feels unfinished. In the end, the case is less about one financier and more about whether systems designed to protect the public can withstand wealth, influence, and secrecy. The documents may continue to surface. But the deeper question remains: when power and accountability collide, who actually answers? Massive release, 3 million pages and counting.
In late January 2026, the U.S. Department of Justice, DOJ, publicly released a massive tranche of documents linked to its investigations into Jeffrey Epstein and his associates. This release, around 3 million pages of documents, 2,000 videos, and 180,000 images, came under the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a federal law passed by Congress requiring most investigative material to be made public. The DOJ said the release completed its review obligation under the law, although critics argue that important materials remain unreleased or heavily redacted. The material spans personal emails, flight logs, financial documents, seized digital communications, photographs, and evidence submitted during investigations. Officials claimed redactions were necessary to protect victim identities and ongoing inquiries, but survivors and advocates say too much was blacked out, especially mentions of powerful men potentially connected to Epstein's activities, and that this imbalance only re-traumatizes victims while shielding others. Names, redactions, and Congress. One of the most contentious issues in early 2026 is what the released files include and what they leave out. The redaction controversy. Lawmakers, including Representatives Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna, say they have seen too many redactions, and they've identified at least 6 men whose names were initially redacted but are likely incriminated, according to congressional review. This has fueled calls in Congress for unredacted publication, partisan disputes over transparency, and efforts to debate releasing more of the material publicly. However, the DOJ argues it must balance transparency with privacy protections for victims and legal obligations relating to grand jury sources. Who's in the files and who isn't charged? The newly released files include extensive references to elite individuals, business leaders, politicians, celebrities, and royalty based on communications with Epstein or appearances in flight logs. Important points from recent reporting include business and political figures. Emails and logs involving prominent business executives such as Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Reid Hoffman, and others have surfaced. Several of these individuals have publicly denied any improper conduct. Royal figures and diplomats. Ongoing scrutiny of Prince Andrew continues, with pressure growing in the UK for broader testimony and institutional accountability. Newly surfaced correspondence suggests high-level diplomatic discussions involving Epstein, including alleged advice to conceal his 2008 conviction on visa forms, bringing attention from UK police to review possible misconduct. Corporate fallout. In the business world, leadership shifts are occurring as reputational risk rises. For example, the chairman of global logistics giant DP World resigned after his past friendship with Epstein was revealed. Important legal note. Being named in files or logs does not mean criminal wrongdoing. The FBI has publicly stated it did not find sufficient evidence to charge additional high-profile individuals with trafficking, and no verified client list exists. Institutional and legal debates. Grand jury records and transparency. In late 2025, a U.S. judge ordered the release of some grand jury records relating to the Maxwell case, which deepened scrutiny of how much evidence the public should see and how protective orders may limit access to fuller context. Maxwell's position. Ghislaine Maxwell, Epstein's closest associate and convicted trafficker, has invoked her Fifth Amendment rights during committee questioning and indicated she might be willing to testify about Epstein's network only in exchange for clemency, a position that is now part of legislative and political debate in Congress. She also has ongoing appeals of her conviction, and her legal team continues to challenge aspects of her 2021 prosecution, a move that could complicate what evidence remains sealed or protected as part of her court record. Survivors speak out. As large quantities of files hit the public domain, many survivors have expressed deep distress. While documents show survivors' names and experiences, some feel that alleged enablers and powerful associates remain shielded by redactions and prosecutorial choices. Several survivors have criticized the DOJ for releasing sensitive information about them while refusing to unseal corroborating details about potential co-conspirators. This has become a major point of contention between advocates and law enforcement. Global impact and misuse. The controversy has spilled beyond U.S. borders. European politicians and diplomats have seen reputational impacts due to various mentions in the files, prompting governmental responses and denials. In some cases, released material has been misused by third parties, such as state media attempting to connect figures like the Dalai Lama to Epstein falsely, a claim rebuffed by official spokespeople as baseless. This highlights that when large troves of documents are released without full context, the misinterpretation or weaponization of information becomes a real risk, especially in geopolitical spaces. Public research and open databases. Amateur and independent researchers, journalists, and online communities have been building searchable databases of the documents, flight logs, and email threads, trying to trace connections, identify patterns, and make sense of the sprawling material. One such effort reports indexing over 1,500,000 documents, including flight manifests and thousands of emails. These databases highlight the tension between formal legal review and public interest research when massive datasets are made available. Media and public attention cycles. The visibility of the Epstein files is not consistent across all media outlets. Some platforms have been criticized for suppressing related content in favor of other headlines, while others frame the files as ongoing scandals involving elite figures. Online discussions range from thoughtful analysis of legal documents to speculation and misinformation. This variability reflects broader debates about media priorities, algorithmic filtering, and public appetite for accountability versus spectacle. What still isn't clear. Despite the vast release of documents, several large questions remain unresolved as of February 2026. Full scope of Epstein's network. Files show contacts, emails, and flight logs, but connection to criminal wrongdoing remains unproven from most named individuals. Why earlier prosecutors negotiated the 2008 deal. Critics still debate the decisions around the lenient plea agreement. What material remains withheld? Even after the Transparency Act, there may be sealed files, grand jury protections, or redactions that prevent full understanding. Why Epstein files still matter. The Epstein files are trending because they intersect with public demand for transparency, accountability for sexual abuse and trafficking, questions about how wealth and power influence justice systems, partisan investigations, and media, social media, and public perception. The files are not just a cache of old documents, they are a living story that challenges societies to balance transparency with victim protection, to distinguish association from criminal activity, and to grapple with how systems handle abuse and power.